I'm Margaret Frondorf, Director of SAIS Alumni Relations, and I'm here with Professor Gianfranco Pasquino, who was a graduate of the Bologna Center class of 1966 and the SAIS class of 1967. And we're here today, and thank you so much for allowing me to visit you here at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., where you're visiting for a month, and we're so glad to have you here. So I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and I wanted to start with, what brought you to SAIS? And tell us a little bit about that story.
I had graduated from the University of Torino in March 1965. And then the Bologna Center had organized a meeting of so-called young leaders with special reference to political science. And I happened to be at the time the president of the students in political science at the University of Torino. So I don't remember if I applied or if I was invited. In any case, I remember that I went to Bologna, incidentally for the first time in my life, in May 1965. And there, the guy who was showing us around was someone who later became the director of the Bologna Center, and Bob Evans. And we visited Bologna, we visited the center, in a way advertised, but in a very soft way, advertised the courses and the type of education one could get at the Bologna Center, graduate education. There was still time to apply, and I applied, and I was accepted, so I went back to Bologna in September 1965 to start my courses. Then I was lucky enough that when a decision to be made, there were 3 places for Italian students in Washington, D.C. I applied and I was accepted as one of the 3. I was rather the second one, if I remember correctly. So I left Italy, I think this was the last trip organized in this way, because first of all I had a Fulbright for transportation between Italy and the US, and second, I was asked if I was interested in accepting a program that meant that American families were hosting a European, a non-American student, I should put it this way, for 1 month at their home. And I said, of course, yes. And so I spent the month of August 1966 in Montclair, New Jersey. It is a very upper-class suburb. The family was made of husband and wife plus four kids who were away during the summer. So in August, I think I met only one of them. Then it was a very pleasant month, by the way. We played tennis, we visited the various high schools, totally different from Italian high schools. And then I arrived in Washington, D.C., and a roommate of mine at the Bologna Center, who is a Texan, now living in California, had found a place to stay, and then I moved into another small place, which is 1616 Riggs Place. If you're familiar with Washington, you remember it is a very short street between 16th and 17th. And then I spent one full year in Washington, D.C. More than that, because I graduated in June 1967, then I went to Brazil, where I had an aunt who died a few years ago, an aunt and a cousin. Spent a couple of months in Brazil, incidentally, in authoritarian Brazil ruled by the military, and so it was very interesting to watch the news filtered by the military and broadcast by TV. Then I came back for another couple of months, and I returned to Italy, I would say, by mid-September 1967.
Well, talk a little bit about some of your first memories of SAIS graduate school. It could either be the school itself, the classes, what was happening around you.
Well, it was the school. It was the way of teaching, fundamentally, which is obviously totally different from the Italian university. I was particularly impressed, and I think this is very important, aspect, because I took a course on contemporary Europe. I think the Europe in the 19th and in the 20th century, that was taught by the chief of the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, whose name was Seth Tillman. And one Saturday afternoon, Tillman invited us. We were probably something like 12 or 14 to his home for just to spend the afternoon. Okay, and so we were eating, drinking, and whatever else. And then at one point, Senator Fulbright himself appeared. And then I learned one word that I was not familiar with. That is the word treat. This is a treat. Indeed, it was a treat.
And so, your favorite class that you, of all time, either at the Bologna Center or in Washington, what was it that just walked away with that was exciting? And
my favorite class that left a significant imprint on my knowledge was a class on, probably, I would say, the political development of Africa. I'm not sure of the title. The teacher was George Lystad, who was, I think, for a time also Dean of Student Affairs, was a quite well-known anthropologist, but he was not just teaching about Africa, he was teaching about development, political development, comparative politics, and so I read a couple of extremely important books that I still remember, Comparative Politics by Ormond and Powell, and One-Party States in West Africa by Aristide Tholberg, that were very useful to me when I decided to become a professional political scientist. Lystad was very inspiring, a very gentle man of Swedish origin, I would say, very capable, and also very good at conducting the seminar. That is, he succeeded in extracting from us not just the answers, which in some cases we didn't have, but the questions. And I learned that to ask the right question is much more important than to have the right answer, also because there is never one right answer. There are several bits of almost right answers. So that was a very, very good class. I have very good memories of that class.
so, as your career developed, and perhaps it's knowing which questions, what are the right questions to ask, you certainly had an illustrious career, and tell us a little bit about that, and perhaps the impact that SAIS had on your career as you moved forward.
Well, I mean, there are, let me put it in theoretical terms. There is a theory that says that you provide explanations through path dependency. And this SAIS opened one door, which is very important. And so all the other doors were no longer interesting to me. So I moved into that door, and the door led, in fact, to the study and later on of teaching of political science. The next door was opened by the fact that I got an appointment at the University of Bologna to teach political science. But then when I'd been in Bologna, I would say for 1 year, probably, I then went back, because my home is Torino. So I went back from Torino to Bologna to teach at the university, and when I arrived there, I taught 1 year and a half, and then I met Simone Serfati, who was then the director of the Bologna Center, and he asked me, what are you doing, and so on and so on. I told him, I've been at SAIS, I have an MA in International Relations, would you like to teach a course at the Bologna Center? And the answer was, of course, an enthusiastic yes. So I started teaching, I think it was probably 1972, I'm not so sure. And then in 1976, Federico Mancini, who had been teaching Italian politics for a long time at the Bologna Center, for almost 20 years, decided not to teach anymore because he had become a judge in an important judicial council. And so the director at the time called me if I was interested in teaching. Federico, in fact, suggested my name, and so I started teaching Italian politics. I've been teaching two courses usually. One is Italian politics, and the other one has been for some time Eurocommunism. Do you remember Eurocommunism? Then political development, then the politics of Southern Europe, Southern European political systems, then comparative national systems, and so on for a long period of time. But without what I learned at SAIS, especially in 1966-67, it would have been very difficult for me to get a position at Italian University in political science. So it was extremely important. What I learned, what I had done, one should not forget that perhaps this will not appear so clear in the recording, that I learned English, because when I arrived here, I knew some English, but not really very much. Now I suppose I know the language well enough.
I think
Say
you're
yes.
fluent. You're fluent. Talk a little bit about your political career.
Well, you know, Machiavelli said that in life there are two forces. One is luck or chance, and the other one is virtue. Okay? Again, I was lucky because I had become, let me put it this way, because it is difficult to praise oneself in an exaggerated way. I become, let's say, rather visible because I was writing in a couple of papers. I was always available to deliver lectures, to participate in political meetings without necessarily having a strong partisan attachment, but a strong left-wing inclination. And so at one point the Communist Party of Bologna, that is a very powerful organization, asked me if I was interested in becoming a parliamentarian. Of course, this is not the correct question, in running for parliament, but obviously they were controlling the votes. Okay? And I thought that it was a very good idea, but I told them, look, I'm not a communist, and I'm not going to become a member of the Communist Party. And they answered, no problem, because in parliament you will be part of a group called the Independent Left. And indeed, the Independent Left was real independent. There is no party discipline. We decided our position, and then we voted usually according to our conscience. As I tell my students, the conscience is never enough. The conscience plus some science. That is, you ought to explain why you vote in a way and not in another way. So I became a member of parliament, in fact a member of the Italian Senate, between 1983 and 1992. Then I lost, and then I won again in 1994, and then I lost again in 1996. But that time I was also somewhat tired, also because Italian politics was changing in a way I didn't like.
So, I know that through your teaching, you're in touch with students quite a bit. And for just us today, if you had to give advice generally to SAIS students, what would you tell them?
Well, first of all, that they must have a sort of very global perspective. They ought to know the politics of their country, perhaps the politics of one area, but they must have a global perspective. You cannot understand what is going on in China, for instance, without knowing something about, for instance, totalitarian regimes. And therefore you must know about the totalitarian regimes of the past, such as National Socialism in Germany, but even in the Soviet Union it was a totalitarian regime. You must know fundamentally the theories, because the facts you may acquire, I mean, Wikipedia may give you the facts. In some cases you must check perhaps what Wikipedia tells you, but if you have no theory, you will never understand what is really going on, and you will never be able to evaluate what is going on. It is, as a very famous scholar, Karl Popper, said, it is always better to have a theory even when the theory is wrong, because if you refine a theory that is wrong, you produce something that is of interest. If you have no theory, you cannot revise anything, and therefore you are lost. The third aspect that I would, the third element that I would suggest the students to acquire is a decent knowledge of some language, and therefore English is never enough. It is true that everybody speaks English, but then when you walk around, if you overhear something that is said in a different language, you get more of a feeling of a country, of a culture, and even of politics. So English. If they are Americans, there should be no problem, even though from time to time the Americans do not really know very well English, but it doesn't matter. And then perhaps Spanish, And then, of course, a foreign language such as Chinese or Arabic, it may be useful. But in any case, it is important to know more than one language.
Thank you for that advice, and thank you for this interview. And we really appreciate it, and we hope to see you in the Bologna Center in due time. So once again, thank you so much, Professor Pasquino.
And I hope to go down into history.
You will.